The night sky was a canvas of black, pierced only by the faint glow of distant flares. The wind roared past the ears of a small group of American soldiers as they plunged from the belly of a military aircraft, their parachutes snapping open like fragile umbrellas against the darkness. Below them lay Nazi-occupied France, a land crawling with enemy troops, fortified towns, and merciless patrols. Every heartbeat echoed with the knowledge that one misstep could mean death. One wrong move, and they would be just another forgotten casualty in a war already soaked in blood. These men were ordinary in every sense, yet tonight they carried an extraordinary burden. They were volunteers, hand-picked for a mission so perilous that even seasoned commanders hesitated to send them. Behind enemy lines, they would face not battalions or divisions, but the full, cold might of the German army, alone. No reinforcements, no escape plan. Only courage, wit, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to fear. As they drifted silently over the countryside, the reality of their task pressed down like the weight of the night itself. One soldier clutched the straps of his chute, eyes scanning the dimly lit fields below. He could see the faint outline of a village, shuttered windows, hiding soldiers who were trained to kill intruders without hesitation. Another tightened his pack, knowing that inside were the tools and explosives meant to cripple enemy supply lines. They were tiny shadows in a massive, hostile world, and yet every shadow had the power to change the course of the war. The wind carried whispers of doubt and fear. Could they survive here, completely isolated, against an enemy known for precision and brutality? Yet with that doubt came a spark, an unspoken understanding among them that history rarely remembers the quiet acts of heroism. These men weren't chasing glory. They were chasing duty, and in doing so, they were stepping into the kind of danger that would etch their courage into legend, if anyone ever remembered them at all. Below, the village lay asleep, unaware of the storm descending upon it. One by one, the soldiers touched down, silent as shadows, hearts hammering. The night swallowed their forms, and in that darkness, fear and resolve fused into a single, unyielding force. Every movement was calculated, every breath measured. Every second could be the difference between survival and death, and yet, as they disappeared into the night, a single question lingered in the air, heavier than the guns and the tanks waiting in the distance. How did these men survive where most would have failed? It was a question that would haunt the memory of every soldier, every commander, and every history book that failed to capture their courage. These were not just men. They were shadows of defiance, sparks of hope in a world shrouded in terror, and the start of a story that would challenge everything we thought we knew about heroism. They were ordinary men, plucked from ordinary lives, farmers, factory workers, students, but in them burned a courage that could not be measured by rank or years of service. Each volunteered for a mission so perilous it would have made seasoned officers pause. These were Americans who chose to face Nazi-occupied Europe alone or in near total isolation, knowing the odds were stacked so heavily against them that survival seemed almost impossible. Take, for example, Lieutenant John Steele. Before the war, he had been a young man with dreams of engineering and quiet weekends at home. But when the call came, Steele didn't hesitate. He left behind the familiar comforts of his life and stepped into the unknown. He was meticulous, calculating every risk, yet beneath his disciplined exterior lay a man terrified of failing those who depended on him. His mission, parachute into Normandy in the early hours of D-Day and disrupt German communications, vital work that could determine the success of an entire invasion. Failure wasn't just death. It was potentially catastrophic for thousands of lives. Then there was Sergeant Donald Graham, a man of few words but fierce resolve. He had grown up in the heartland, where courage was measured in acts of everyday survival. But Graham's battlefield would be far from the fields he knew. His assignment required him to sabotage enemy supply lines in the dense forests of the Ardennes, often moving alone through freezing nights with nothing but a map, a compass, and an unshakable sense of duty. He carried the weight of knowing that capture meant torture, betrayal, or death, yet he volunteered without hesitation. These men were joined by Private First Class Charles Henry, barely out of his teens, whose innocence had been replaced by a resolve forged in fire. Charles' mission was a reconnaissance operation, infiltrating a heavily guarded town to gather intelligence on German troop movements. Every day brought the knowledge that a single misstep could cost him his life. But Charles pressed on, driven by a sense of purpose larger than himself, the belief that his actions, however small, could tip the scales of a global war. The preparation for these missions was as daunting as the missions themselves. Hours were spent poring over maps by candlelight, memorizing village layouts, patrol schedules, and supply routes. They practiced sabotage techniques, mastered the silent movement of terrain, and rehearsed emergency escape strategies, knowing that improvisation could be the difference between life and death. They carried equipment that was often insufficient, weapons that jammed, and communication devices that were rudimentary at best. Every choice, every step, was a gamble with fate. Yet beneath the strategic planning lay an emotional core. These men were driven by patriotism, yes, but also by a personal code of courage. They knew they were stepping into the abyss alone. They understood the loneliness that would accompany each dark night behind enemy lines. They embraced the fear that gnawed at them like a shadow, because they understood that fear was both a tool and a test. It sharpened their senses, focused their minds, and tempered their resolve. As they moved through forests, fields, and towns during their final rehearsals, the enormity of the task became clear. One soldier paused at the edge of a cliff, looking over the valley that would soon be crawling with enemy patrols. He understood that survival wasn't guaranteed, that rescue was unlikely, and that the eyes of history would rarely notice the sacrifices they were about to make. Yet he stepped forward anyway, feeling the weight of duty settle over him like armor. The suspense of these missions was constant. Even in the planning stages, the danger was tangible. A misread map, a loose wire on an explosive, or a careless word could unravel months of preparation. Each soldier knew that while the odds were grim, the alternative, inaction, was far worse. Europe's fate depended not on armies alone, but on men who dared to step into darkness, unarmed with reinforcements, armed only with courage, wits, and the sheer will to survive. And yet, despite all this, these men were largely forgotten. Their names rarely appeared in history books. Their actions, while heroic, were invisible to the world they fought to protect. But in those quiet moments before departure, as they loaded their gear and prepared to leap into the unknown, they felt neither regret nor fear. Not truly. They felt purpose, a sense of belonging to something far greater than themselves. Each heartbeat was a promise. They would do what needed to be done, even if no one ever remembered. As the night of deployment approached, a silence fell over their quarters. The weight of anticipation pressed down like the very sky itself. Each man knew the coming hours could be their last, yet no hesitation lingered. Their courage, forged in the fires of ordinary lives and extraordinary resolve, would carry them into the unknown. And as they stepped into the dark, parachutes packed and hearts steeled, one unspoken question hovered in the air. Could ordinary men truly face the impossible and survive? This question would be answered only in the crucible of action, where fear met resolve, and history tested the mettle of America's forgotten heroes. The darkness of night was both a shield and a threat, as the soldiers moved silently through the forest. Branches clawing at their faces and uniforms, every step was calculated, every rustle of leaves a potential alarm. Below them, the faint lights of a German-occupied village twinkled, deceptively peaceful. They knew the calm was a trap. Inside, enemy soldiers slept in shifts. Guards patrolled with sharp eyes, and the distant hum of machinery hinted at the industrial heart of the war. One wrong move, one careless breath, and their lives would end before dawn. Lieutenant Steele led the small group, his eyes scanning the terrain like a hawk. The moonlight cut through the canopy, revealing uneven ground and hidden ditches that could break a leg, or worse, leave a soldier vulnerable to discovery. Every few steps, he signaled for silence, hand gestures replacing words, their communication reduced to gestures honed through training. The weight of the mission pressed down on each of them. They were invisible hunters, shadows tasked with crippling a vast and powerful enemy without drawing a single breath of attention. They crossed frozen streams and trudged through mud-soaked fields. Rain began to fall, soaking their uniforms and chilling their bones. The wind carried the faint clatter of German boots on cobblestones from the nearby village. Each sound became magnified in the soldiers' minds, a dog barking, a door creaking, a distant shout. They froze, hearts hammering, trusting in their training, praying the darkness would conceal them. Private Charles Henry crept forward, carefully marking patrol routes in his mind. He had memorized the guard rotations and the timing of searchlights. Every second was critical. One misstep could ignite a chain reaction, alerting soldiers, summoning reinforcements, and turning a covert mission into a deadly trap. And yet, despite the fear, a thrill coursed through him. This was the moment they had trained for, the culmination of months of preparation and sacrifice. Their first objective was sabotage. Graham carefully set explosives along the enemy supply line, the ticking of the clock inside his mind louder than the silent timer on the device. The explosion had to happen precisely at dawn, ensuring maximum disruption without risking detection beforehand. Every wire was triple-checked, every mechanism examined, their lives hanging on the precision of their work. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of the fragile balance between success and annihilation. But even preparation could not erase danger entirely. As Steele reconnoitered the village edge, a sudden beam of a searchlight swept across the path. He flattened himself against the wet ground, heart hammering, feeling the warm mud cling to his face. German soldiers were near, closer than he anticipated. Each second stretched into eternity as the light passed, their breaths shallow, bodies frozen. When the danger passed, he exhaled in relief, but the knowledge remained. They were constantly vulnerable, and one slip could undo everything. The soldiers encountered more than enemy troops. The terrain itself was an adversary. Thick forests, steep hills, and treacherous rivers slowed their progress. Frostbite nipped at fingers and toes, and exhaustion weighed on every muscle. Yet retreat was not an option. Each step forward was a step toward the mission's success, and failure was not merely personal. It could alter the fate of entire battalions waiting beyond enemy lines. They gathered intelligence, observing supply depots and communication hubs, noting weaknesses in enemy defenses. A young soldier risked climbing a guard tower for a better vantage, narrowly avoiding detection when a guard turned just in time. Sweat and rain streaked their faces, adrenaline sharpening their senses. Every observation, every scrap of information became a weapon in itself, capable of shaping operations that could save countless lives. Yet beneath the action lay a constant hum of fear. They were isolated, surrounded by thousands of trained, ruthless soldiers, and any miscalculation could be fatal. The magnitude of what they faced was staggering, but the men pressed on, moving with determination that belied their exhaustion. They had crossed the line between ordinary and extraordinary, and there was no turning back. As they prepared to retreat back to their rendezvous point, a faint sound froze them in their tracks. A solitary dog barking, a flicker of movement in a window, the metallic glint of a rifle barrel in the moonlight. Their hearts pounded and time seemed to slow. One wrong choice here could undo everything, leaving them captured or worse. It was a reminder that even the smallest detail could tip the balance between life and death. The soldiers moved on, shadows, slipping through the night, every step a blend of fear and courage. The forest swallowed them, concealing their passage, but the threat of discovery never left. In the distance, the faint glow of dawn began to seep across the horizon, signaling the end of their first night behind enemy lines. Yet one question lingered in their minds, heavier than any weapon. Could they complete their mission without paying the ultimate price? The answer would come only in the heart of danger, where courage collided with terror, and history waited silently for its unsung heroes. The forest that had once shielded them now seemed to weigh them down. Every footstep felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself recognized the burden these men carried. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, exhaustion clawed at their muscles, and yet their minds refused to surrender. Fighting alone, or in units so small they were nearly invisible, was an ordeal that tested more than skill. It tested the very essence of human endurance. Lieutenant Steele felt it most sharply. Each decision carried the weight of life and death, not only for himself, but for every man under his command. A miscalculated move could leave a comrade trapped in enemy fire. A moment's hesitation could turn a minor mission into catastrophe. At night, he lay awake, listening to the distant rumble of artillery and the whispers of the wind through the trees, questioning every choice he had made. The isolation was suffocating, but he could not allow doubt to paralyze him. The psychological toll was as brutal as the physical. Sergeant Graham moved silently along the edge of a village, eyes scanning for enemy patrols. Yet his mind wandered to memories of home, of a small kitchen table where he and his family had laughed together, now thousands of miles away. The contrast between the warmth of those memories and the stark danger surrounding him was almost unbearable. Civilians peeked cautiously from windows, unsure whether to trust or betray the strangers in their midst. Every interaction carried a moral weight. Could they endanger innocent lives for the sake of their mission? Could one misjudged step condemn an entire family? The ethical tightrope was as treacherous as any battlefield. Private Charles Henry faced his own reckoning. He had learned that sometimes courage required a quiet kind of cruelty. Sabotaging supply depots meant destroying food, medicine, and resources that others depended on, even if those resources were meant for the enemy. He wrestled with the knowledge that every action, however necessary, carried unintended consequences. His hands trembled as he planted explosives beneath a rail line, but he steadied them with the thought that each act brought Allied forces one step closer to victory. The tension between duty and conscience was constant, a shadow that threatened to swallow every triumph. Even so, there were moments of unexpected hope. When Steele's team successfully disrupted a German communication hub, the soldiers felt a fleeting but profound sense of accomplishment. A single message intercepted, a signal delayed, a supply route momentarily crippled. These were small victories, but in the chaos of war, they carried the weight of salvation. Each success was a spark, illuminating the path forward, reminding them why they had volunteered for the impossible. The physical strain was relentless. Nights were spent crouched in wet ditches, shivering under threadbare blankets, while days were filled with long treks across fields, avoiding patrols and navigating unforgiving terrain. Frostbite, blisters, and fatigue were constant companions, yet the men pressed on, driven by a mixture of fear and determination. Every step tested their resilience, every breath their willpower. It was a brutal education in endurance, and only those who could withstand both mind and body would survive. Encounters with civilians added a layer of unpredictable tension. In one village, a young boy stared wide-eyed as Graham passed, clutching his small satchel of supplies. The soldiers knew that any interaction could tip the delicate balance of secrecy. One wrong word, one gesture misread, and their cover would be blown. Yet sometimes the glimmer of human connection reminded them that the world they fought to protect was worth every hardship. A whispered warning, a quietly shared ration, even a fleeting look of understanding from a stranger became lifelines in a war dominated by chaos and cruelty. Still, the ever-present threat of failure loomed like a shadow. Every mission carried consequences, and the weight of potential catastrophe was never far from their minds. When an unexpected patrol stumbled upon Steele's hiding spot, the soldiers froze, hearts pounding, breaths shallow. One false move would not only mean death but the undoing of weeks of careful planning. And yet, with calculated patience, they slipped away, leaving behind the enemy none the wiser. A minor victory, but a victory nonetheless, and a reminder that courage was as much about survival as heroism. Through the fatigue, fear, and moral ambiguity, one thing remained clear. These men were ordinary in their beginnings, but extraordinary in their resolve. They endured isolation, hunger, and the constant shadow of death, not because they were fearless, but because they were determined. They bore the cost of bravery in their bones, their minds, and their hearts, each scar a testament to the unseen struggle that defined their missions. As they paused on a ridge overlooking a village, rain dripping from their helmets and mud streaking their faces, they allowed themselves a brief moment of reflection. The night had tested them, the enemy had threatened them, and yet they remained unbroken. Every small success, every narrow escape became a thread woven into a tapestry of courage and defiance, and still the most dangerous moments lay ahead, as the ultimate test of their heroism loomed, a test that would demand more than skill or training, but the full measure of their hearts. In the silence of that rainy night, one thought echoed in each soldier's mind. We have survived this far, but how far can courage alone carry us? The night was thicker than ever, a black velvet curtain pressed over the countryside. Lieutenant Steele and his small band of men approached their most dangerous mission yet, a heavily fortified German supply depot critical to the enemy's operations in the region. Intelligence had revealed the depot's defenses, tripwires, armed guards, and watchtowers, but failure was not an option. Every second they hesitated increased the chance that the depot would remain intact, prolonging the suffering of thousands on the front lines. Steele crouched in the shadows, studying the layout through a pair of binoculars. His team was a whisper against the night, silent as shadows, but inside each soldier, adrenaline coursed like wildfire. They moved with synchronized precision, a delicate choreography of life and death. Graham led the way through a narrow ravine, avoiding a patrol of 4 German soldiers. One misstep, one rustling leaf could expose them all. Yet they pressed on, hearts pounding, minds razor-sharp. The operation required ingenuity as much as courage. Steele divided his team, sending Charles Henry to disable the communications tower, while he and Graham approached the main storage area. The young private slipped through a narrow gap in the fencing, timing his movements with the guard rotations memorized weeks ago. One guard turned unexpectedly, forcing Charles to press against the metal wall, barely escaping detection. Every second was a gamble, every breath a silent prayer. Explosives were planted with precision, wires connected and timers set, each device a promise of disruption and a threat to anyone who miscalculated. When the final fuse was secured, Steele signaled the others to retreat, hearts hammering in unison. The soldiers slipped back through the forest, but before they could reach safety, the first explosion erupted. Flames roared and smoke billowed into the night, illuminating the terrified faces of the enemy soldiers, scrambling in confusion. In that chaos, the hero's ingenuity shone. Graham intercepted a group of reinforcements attempting to organize a counterattack, using a well-timed distraction to mislead them. Charles scaled the communications tower and destroyed critical lines, severing the enemy's ability to coordinate effectively. Every action, every risk taken, compounded into a victory that seemed almost impossible against such overwhelming odds. By dawn, the depot lay in ruins, supplies destroyed, communications severed, and the enemy scrambling to respond. The soldiers had changed the course of operations in the region. Their actions, executed with daring precision, saved countless lives and delayed enemy reinforcements, yet no one in the wider world would hear their names. The victory was theirs alone, hard-won and nearly invisible. As they vanished into the forest, mud streaked across faces and exhaustion, threatening to collapse their bodies. When truth settled over them, Courage alone could not guarantee survival, but it could create moments that reshaped history. The soldiers had survived the night, but the war was far from over. And the dangers ahead promised to test them even more, and in the quiet aftermath of their triumph, a single, haunting thought lingered. How many more impossible nights would they endure before history remembered or forgot their sacrifice? The war ended with fanfare, parades and medals for many, but for the men who had risked everything behind enemy lines, recognition was elusive. Lieutenant Steele, Sergeant Graham, and Private Charles Henry returned home physically intact, but emotionally fractured, carrying memories that could never be measured on a piece of paper or adorned with a ribbon. Their acts of bravery, disabling supply depots, intercepting communications, and surviving against impossible odds, were crucial. Yet history often overlooked the quiet heroes who had operated in shadows. Steele returned to civilian life with a sense of accomplishment tempered by a lingering emptiness. His neighbors saw him as a veteran, but few understood the magnitude of what he had done. The nights he had spent crouched in mud, the sound of German boots echoing near his hiding place, the fear that had gripped him in the silence, none of it was celebrated. Letters of commendation were few, and medals rarer still. Even among his own military peers, the missions that had saved countless lives were often considered routine operations, as if survival and ingenuity in isolation were not worthy of mention. Graham faced a different kind of struggle. He had returned to the Midwest, hoping to find solace in familiar fields and old friends. But memories of frostbitten toes, endless nights in enemy territory, and the faces of civilians he had tried to protect haunted him relentlessly. When he spoke of his experiences, he was met with polite nods or polite disbelief. Few could grasp the reality of acting alone, or nearly alone, against an organized, ruthless enemy. His heroics were acknowledged only in whispers among those who had witnessed them firsthand. A small, private audience that could never fully honor the sacrifices made. Charles Henry, barely 21 when the war ended, struggled with reintegration in a society that didn't comprehend the scope of his trials. The intelligence he had gathered, the lives he had saved through covert actions, were now classified or buried in dusty archives. No medals marked his courage. No plaques commemorated his nights spent in the darkness, evading capture while performing acts that had changed the course of local operations. Yet the memories persisted. The adrenaline, the fear, the thrill of survival, and the grief for comrades lost. Every quiet morning reminded him that the world had moved on, while he carried the weight of histories almost entirely invisible. The injustice of anonymity was compounded by bureaucratic obstacles. Official recognition required paperwork, witnesses, and validation. And for men who had operated alone or in tiny units, there were often no witnesses beyond themselves. Recommendations were lost in piles of files, reports dismissed as inconsequential, and the deeds of these forgotten soldiers faded into the background of a world eager to celebrate victories visible to the masses. History remembered battles and generals, not the men who risked everything in silence. Yet despite the lack of accolades, there was a quiet dignity in their survival. Every mission completed, every life protected, every sabotage executed successfully was a victory that mattered in ways larger than medals or ceremonies. Their heroism existed in the lives saved, the operations disrupted, and the courage demonstrated in the face of isolation and near certain danger. In the shadows of history, they were giants, even if the world refused to name them. In letters to one another, in the rare reunions that occurred decades later, they shared memories that official histories ignored. They laughed quietly over near-death encounters, recounted ingenious maneuvers that had saved their lives, and mourned silently for those who never returned. These private acknowledgments became a lifeline, a testament that courage, even when unseen, had value. And yet there was a lingering sorrow. How many stories were lost because the men who lived them were too modest, too tired, or too silenced by circumstance to claim recognition? How many ordinary citizens could truly grasp the terror, the ingenuity, and the endurance that had defined those missions? The world had moved on, yet these men remained tethered to the shadows of memory, their sacrifices invisible to all but themselves. It is in remembering them that we honor true heroism. Theirs is not a story of parades and public accolades, but of courage executed in silence, survival against impossible odds, and actions that reshaped local battles while remaining invisible to history. These men remind us that heroism does not always seek recognition, that bravery can exist in solitude, and that the cost of duty is often carried in quiet reflection long after the war has ended. As the sun set on their lives, and their stories threatened to fade completely, when truth endured, these forgotten heroes had faced Germany alone, and in doing so, they had defined the very essence of courage. And now it falls upon us to remember them, not for medals, not for glory, but for the sheer weight of their sacrifice, and the lasting echo of their bravery in a world that often forgets the quiet warriors who saved it. The echoes of war may fade, but the impact of courage endures. The soldiers who risked everything behind enemy lines did more than survive. They shaped the course of history in ways few would ever know. Lieutenant Steele, Sergeant Graham, and Private Charles Henry were ordinary men, transformed by extraordinary circumstances, each step they took against impossible odds, sending ripples through the war effort. Their actions, executed in silence and isolation, had disrupted enemy operations, saved countless lives, and altered the course of local battles. Though history often overlooked them, the significance of their heroism cannot be measured merely in medals or recognition. It is measured in the lives they touched, the missions they succeeded in, and the bravery they embodied. Their legacy is subtle but profound. The sabotage of a supply depot, the interception of vital communications, the intelligence gathered under the cover of night, all of it contributed to victories that reverberated far beyond the small forests, towns and rivers where these soldiers risked their lives. Every successful mission weakened the enemy, protected Allied forces, and shortened the path to liberation. And yet, for every historian who chronicled grand battles and famous generals, few remembered the men who acted alone, whose courage was unsung, but no less vital. Even in anonymity, their resilience offers a lesson for all. Heroism does not always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it thrives in quiet courage, in the willingness to act when failure seems inevitable, and in the determination to persevere despite fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty. These soldiers faced the darkness of war alone, relying on skill, intuition, and sheer determination. They remind us that true bravery is not always public. It is private, enduring, and often invisible. The legacy of these forgotten heroes also carries an emotional weight. Imagine the cold nights spent crouched in mud, the constant awareness of enemy patrols, the moral dilemmas faced when innocent lives were at stake, and the overwhelming isolation of acting without reinforcements. They endured hardships that most of us can scarcely imagine, and yet they pressed on, guided by duty, patriotism, and an unshakable belief in the righteousness of their cause. Their courage was not performative. It was lived in moments of terrifying reality, a testament to human fortitude when confronted with the unimaginable. Today, remembering them is more than a historical exercise. It is an act of respect, gratitude, and moral recognition. By telling their stories, by honoring the sacrifices made in silence, we keep their spirit alive. Every retelling is a ripple of acknowledgement, a small but enduring tribute to men who did not act for fame, reward, or applause, but because the world depended on their bravery. Their courage teaches us that heroism can exist even in isolation, that resilience can shape outcomes even when unseen, and that the impact of one determined individual or a small group can reverberate far beyond what the eye can measure. As we reflect on their lives, when truth becomes undeniable, these men faced Germany alone, against overwhelming odds, yet they survived, succeeded, and left a mark that history should never forget. Their legacy is not merely in the battles won, but in the enduring example they set, a standard of bravery, ingenuity, and selflessness that continues to inspire. So let us remember them. Let us honor the shadows of courage, the silent victories, and the ordinary men who became extraordinary. For in remembering these forgotten heroes, we ensure that their bravery is never lost to time, and that their sacrifice continues to illuminate the meaning of true heroism. The night may have swallowed their names, but the courage of these forgotten soldiers still shines, guiding us to understand the profound impact of standing resolute, even when no one is watching.